talk about that for a moment, because I'm going to jump to this next question, which was we were going to come to later. But since you're kind of right there anyway, let's go ahead and talk about it. Adi says, "What do you do when an overzealous lawyer sends you via Google or Apple a removal notice since your app is using your freshly received trademark? What's allowed and what's not allowed to be used?"
Sure. Again, a very broad question. So I'm gonna try and answer it broadly and give a few examples.
So you just said, hey, if I have received a trademark on something, I should send out a letter to somebody letting them know, right?
Well, okay. So a couple of things. I think first, let's start with what it is that trademark law protects, right? So when someone, because the letter may not be overzealous, right? It really depends. If they do have, look, it's never going to feel good to get one of those letters, right? I'm not saying like, you should be happy. Of course, they're not fun to receive. But there is a difference. I have seen totally justified ones where I've said to my client, look, probably should have Googled before you chose that name. And unfortunately, this sucks, but unfortunately they've got a decent case and it's not worth fighting on this because you probably lose. And I've seen ones where I look at it and I say, okay, you make a game and they do locksmithing services for roadside assistance. This is like probably computer generated, or they looked at it for 3 seconds and just spam it out to everyone who has the word lock in their name. And that's, we can ignore this. There's a big spectrum. So trademark law, which is different than, it's separate from copyright law. Copyright, think of it as your content. The art, the code, the dialogue, sound, the UI, all that stuff that you can see and hear and perform. Trademark is all about the brand. And so trademark law all comes out of this idea of protecting consumers from being confused. So that's why it covers like taglines, logos, and names. And so in trademark law, you can have trademark rights even if you haven't registered. When people talk about trademarking something, usually what they're referring to is filing, and I'm speaking of US law here, by the way. They're speaking, but most countries have an equivalent process. The EU has it, Canada. And when they talk about trademarking something, they mean filing with the Patent and Trademark Office an application that says, we would like you to recognize that we have trademark protection in this term for these goods or services. You do have rights that come about even before you've done that if you start selling things. So as soon as I use a name to sell stuff, I start to accrue trademark rights. They're called common law rights. Those are based on state laws. They're harder to prove. They're not as broad. You have to go and show, okay, my tattoo parlor's been open on this street for the last 12 years. Here's a picture when we opened. Here's the date, and here's how broadly our customer base is. That's a lot harder than saying, here, the PTO granted our trademark application. When you have that, it gives you a couple of benefits over the common law stuff, which is that it means your trademark applies equally strongly across all 50 states, regardless of where you're based. It gives you some positive presumptions if you end up in court. Basically, they start from the assumption that your trademark's valid and the other people have to prove that it isn't, which is helpful. And most importantly, it lets you call dibs in advance. I said before that you get your rights when you start selling something. They call that use in commerce. So you have to actually be selling something with the name to get the rights. This is an exception. You can basically apply and say, we intend, in good faith, we intend to use this soon. Like, for instance, for software, we're in development. We know the name. It's going to be done in a year, but we want to get the name locked down now. Perfect example. People do that all the time. You can't call dibs forever. There's a maximum of 3 years. You have to do it in 6-month increments. It requires filing something on time. So all of that to say that if someone sends you the letter, you want to do a couple of things. First, you want to check and make sure that what they're telling you is valid, right? So it could be BS. And the way to tell if you've got a real problem is, one, go and check, first of all, see if they're just saying we have trademark rights, or if they're saying we have a registered trademark. If they're just saying they have trademark rights, it's going to be in the form of something like, we've been using this name to sell this software since 2007. Okay, go and do some Googling, make sure that they really have been selling it since then, right? If they're claiming that you're infringing a registered trademark, there's a couple of simple things you can do. You can go on the PTO website, the Patent and Trademark Office, uspto.gov, and they have you can do Boolean searches. There's a lot of things, but for a non-lawyer, you can go in and just search the actual name. Make sure that their trademark exists and that it's live, meaning it hasn't been abandoned. And then here's the other thing. You don't just trademark a word. A lot of times people have this idea that someone grabbed a word. It's like, oh, they just bought that word in the English language. That's ridiculous. Well, not really. Usually the trademark isn't a single word. It's, whatever, maybe there's like a kennel called the Dog Whisperers or something. They didn't trademark the name dog. They trademarked specifically that phrase, the Dog Whisperers. And when they trademarked or when they filed their application, they had to say what classes of goods and services it was for. And so there are 40-something international classes that they kind of split everything, every good and service that you can imagine falls into one of these, right? For purposes of this podcast, probably class 9, which is software, and all sorts of other stuff like nautical instruments and scientific instruments. Yeah, they designed these long before software was a big thing. So if someone has something that's the same name as your app, but it's like a toilet paper company or dog toys, that's not nearly as much of an issue as if it's in class 9 and it's for software. And even if it's in the same class, it may not, there's all these other things. So there's the class, and then within that, there'll be some language. There'll just a list of a whole bunch of things that will basically be they're describing the goods and services. And it could be that it's for scientific instruments, right? And your thing is a game. Okay, they're technically the same class because these classes are really broad, but you might be able to look at that and say, you know what, these aren't really the same. And the reason that works is that trademark is not about, did you copy my stuff? It's about, will consumers get confused looking at these two names and think they're from the same company? So that's the argument you'd make. So first, make sure that they're not full of crap. If they're not full of crap, then you may be in trouble. You have to decide, is it worth fighting over it, right? Is it worth splitting hairs and trying to make an argument, and saying, we don't think so, and we're not going to change our name? Or can you just say, you know what, we'll design a new logo and change the name and move on? That's what you do in response to it. Ahead of time, again, do that search on the PTO site and do the Googling. It doesn't take long. It's free. If you're really concerned, you can pay firms or an attorney to go through and do like an extensive thing. Whenever I do trademarks for clients as part of the package, I always will do a search ahead of time, and that's to lower the chances that there's a problem, right? Giant companies are not immune from this. Perfect example for gamers out there: Blizzard just released a game called Overwatch. They paid a lot of money because their trademark attorney made a mistake, which is didn't do a simple Google search to realize there was already a fairly large game out there called Overwatch. Well, they'd already committed to everything. They wanted the name, and they had to basically settle and probably pay these people a huge amount for the rights. That could have been avoided with a simple search. So that's sort of the preemptive stuff you do. So that's kind of my answer. It's not always a BS thing. And don't get too attached to the name. Sometimes people spend a lot of tears and a lot of effort and a lot of money when they could just change the name and move on.
Yeah, and I totally agree. It never feels good to get a cease and desist letter. I've received them a number of times, and it's just not